Hello, class. This is Mr. Andrews. Sorry I couldn't be with you today, but I wanted to go over exactly what Unit 3 is going to involve for us. We're now transitioning to our third and final unit, the unit that has to do with looking at various perspectives or ways of reading literature. This unit is called Reading Literature in Context. So I should explain what context means. And in order to do that, a really good starting point would be to think about where have we been to understand where we're going. So let's kind of look back at the other units that we've had in this course so far. In the very first unit, you'll see is unit 1, we were really focused on understanding poetry by looking at the details of the poem specifically and really just focusing down on how the details and the patterns within those details, similar to what you did in 131, really add up to the sort of interior analysis that we can do. In other words, we were really focused on understanding a text by looking at it itself. The thing was, in the second unit, we kind of expanded our view. So we weren't just simply looking at the interior of a text or just the details within a text. We also started to have conversations comparing texts and understanding them by comparing them with other texts. So in unit 2, we really started to expand outward, looking at how texts can be understood by comparing them to other texts, specifically by looking at the genre of a journey or a coming of age story. We looked at things like archetypes and tropes and all these sort of historical and cultural references that you sometimes see echoed and used again and again, and sometimes changed over time, but still used repeatedly through different and various texts. So we've sort of looked at different ways so far of understanding literature by first looking at the literature itself in a vacuum, and then in the second unit, expanding out and looking at the literature in terms of its genre or category, or by comparing it to similar texts. The final unit now, we're going to expand even further by looking at and understanding literature by comparing and connecting it to our world. In what ways does a piece of literature have a relationship to our world? That whether it's our modern society, our personal lives, or even the history and the culture in which it was written. All of these can help to explain and understand literature, just like the other two units provided some as well. Now, in order to introduce this unit, I really want to introduce the different lenses we're going to be applying to literature in this unit. This is really a unit where we're going to look at a variety of perspectives on literature, not merely similar stories or similar genre stories or strategy, excuse me, or strategies for just understanding a story's details. Instead, we're going to start looking at what are some different ways of approaching how stories deal with different real world topics, and what are the messages that stories might have encoded in them, and how might they reveal something to us about ourselves or the worlds they were written in. So what I want to do in order to explain this whole thing is to show you exactly how complicated things have really gotten for literature scholars, because it really started out quite simple when literature as a sort of, if you will, as a discipline or a field of study really first was developed. A lot of the thoughts surrounded this sort of idea of a singular meaning, right? That a text carried in it its own meaning that could, if you took the right approach and were smart enough and methodical enough and accurate enough, you could figure it out, that a text has the same meaning across the board. Now, of course, we don't feel that way anymore about text. We feel it's a lot more complicated than that. But that's because in many ways, the way we've started to think about the world and about language has changed. And so as a result, of course, the way we think about literature has changed too. It's a reflection of the times. So one of the things we started thinking about was, hey, maybe in order to understand a text, we can't just look at what it says. We actually also have to start by understanding other things like the author. And so we expanded out to the author, starting to do things like study the history of the person themselves who wrote it. And by understanding the author, we might start to understand the text, but it didn't stop there, because as time went on, schools of thought began to develop that said, hey, maybe it's not enough to just know the author, because the author is a product of their environment too. Maybe we also need to understand the author's world. Maybe we need to understand the time and the place where the author lived. And so history started to be connected to the study of literature as well. And then we got into understanding the reader, right? By understanding things like psychology and your own knowledge and awareness of other texts, we can also understand that, hey, readers are going to have a big impact on the way a text is interpreted too, because my psychology is probably going to change the way I read something, right? But then it doesn't stop there, because as it turns out, there's a lot of layers to this. When we look at a text, it's not in a vacuum. It exists surrounded by all of these factors, whether it's the author's own life and biases and worldviews, the world that the author grew up in, the reader, you, and what you bring to the table and all that knowledge and all those biases. But then stepping out into this big white void here on the chart, we've got the reader's world. Think about it, the very time and place in which you live is also going to have an impact on the way you actually read and interpret the literature. So holy crap, as it turns out, literature doesn't necessarily have this sort of singular go-to concrete one size fits all meaning. Instead, over time, we started to add these layers of understanding, but these layers came from a thing called critical theory. Critical theory is a way of thinking about a text or how to understand a text. And as it turns out, we didn't always think the same way about literature. As time has gone by, we started to add different ways of understanding literature. People, for instance, didn't used to do research on the author, or at least that much research on the author. It wasn't important to, for instance, the Greeks to necessarily understand who Homer was in order to understand the Iliad, right? It was a text written in their time and place for their time and place. But as things go by, we've begun to realize through a variety of reasons, really, that in order to understand any text, we have to understand all these other things that surround it. And so what are critical theories? Well, critical theory is a method of interpreting or evaluating a text. And I don't mean evaluating in the sense of like it's good or bad, but in terms of just how does it match up with or relate to the world in which it was written, the genre in which it was written, the kind of expectations we might have for that kind of writing written by that author, written at that time, written in that culture, written in that place, right? That's what we mean by evaluating. It's all about understanding. So in other words, critical theories are different paradigms. They're lenses for interpreting a text. And what's really cool is as time's gone by, rather than it being this sort of debate between which is the best critical theory to end all theories, it's really become more postmodern than that. When I say postmodern, what I mean is that it's become more about having a multitude of theories rather than just having one singular one to answer it. What we really learned is that literature can be best understood by examining it through many of these theories. And each of them offer a different perspective, a different angle, a different layer of literature that all really can be added together to give us a better sense of the sort of entirety of what this literature or story or novels meaning and significance might be. So critical theories are based in scholars' efforts to understand text, right? But we try to understand text for a variety of reasons. And of course, those reasons have to do with the theories. They could be historical reasons. Maybe we just want to understand the history of it, right? Maybe it's more social. We want to understand what the text has to say about class or race or gender. But also it might be cultural significance. We want to understand how The Great Gatsby might have had a really significant impact on American thinking and culture. And so we're going to look at that as well. All of these are the different schools of thought. And there are 4 different ones we're just going to focus on here today. You're going to next do a little bit of first research on just 4 of these schools of thought. And there's a lot more than this, is worth noting, but these are 4 really prevalent ones, 4 really common ones. And in fact, as you research them, you may find, I've definitely done this in class before. Teacher didn't call it new historicist theory, but I was definitely exercising new historicist theory. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those background ideas to some of the things you may have been doing with literature all along. Now, on each of these slides, I've included a different critical theory for interpreting literature. And with a partner, what I'm going to ask you to do is just a little bit of research on the web into what that theory is about. And there's 3 things that I'm going to ask for specifically on each slide. But when you're done, what I'm going to ask you and what I'm going to ask the sub to facilitate is for you guys amongst yourselves to present your slide to the rest of the class. This doesn't mean standing up in front of the class or anything. It's not formal, but instead just from your seat, showing us the slide. Now the substitute will have access to this. I've shared the link with them. And you're going to simply just explain to us what are the cliff notes of that particular theory. So the 4 theories you're going to deal with here today, and if you're in my B3 class, I apologize, your names aren't up here. These are for my B2 class. Your names will be at the top of your slide that you're assigned to. So Jamie and Luke, you're assigned to new historicism. With each slide, what you're going to do is 3 things. You're going to explain what is it, and try to make it student friendly. Try to really make it something that will be understandable by your peers. Don't just copy and paste some scholar's definition, but really try to translate this so it really makes sense. You're, in essence, becoming a teacher for a moment. Teach us about new historicism. So what is it? What is that way or lens by which we might think about literature? The second thing you're going to do is fill in this box that says, how would it change the way you read a text? There, I want you to describe if you were a scholar reading this way, or you were to read a story with this approach or lens, what would be some of the things you would focus on? How would you maybe go about reading it? What details would you pay attention to? What details would you ignore? That's what you want to include in that box. And then finally, key questions. There, I want you to simply choose or come up with, what do you think are some questions that people who read with this approach are primarily interested in understanding? In other words, what are the things they want to understand about a story or a piece of literature? And try to articulate those in question form. Now, there's a couple other schools of thought: feminist criticism, Marxist criticism, and genre theory. Be careful not to oversimplify. It's quite possible that you'll see the words feminist and Marxist and assume you know what it means, but really look at it closely because it might not be as simple as you think. That said, take about 20 minutes or so to complete putting together these slides, and then maybe a few minutes each just going around the classroom, sharing with the class what your findings were about that theory. Now, when you are done with this brief introduction to critical theory, what I'm going to ask you to do next is just take some time here in class today to read Battle Royal. It's plain and simple, and the page number can be found on today's agenda. But Battle Royal is, I will give you a little bit of a warning. It's a severe story. It is graphic. It does have some violence in it and some not so nice language, if you will. I think you absolutely can handle it as seniors in a college class. So I want you to know, if you're reading and you're going, geez, this is heavy, it's nothing I don't think you can handle. And 2, I would add to that this is a really important story. And I hope that you'll recognize that as you're reading it, the importance of its ideas. And speaking of which, reading it today, I really want you to just focus on your own thoughts, reactions, responses to it. There's no journal. I'm just asking you to read and annotate. Tomorrow on your virtual day, however, we're going to take a different approach. I'm going to ask you to engage in a little bit of new historicist reading of this. And you'll see what that involves when your new historicist people explain it. But there is a historical document that I'm going to ask you to read tomorrow. It's a nonfiction document. It's the first one we read in this class, which makes sense. It's a literature class after all. But you're going to take that historical document, and I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of comparison and analysis in terms of how its ideas might be connected to the time and the place in which this story was written. That said, I hope you enjoy Battle Royal. Enjoy might be a strong word, but I do hope that it's a very meaningful experience reading that. It is a well-written story and a very important one. So that said, if you have questions for me individually, do reach out to me. But that is it from me, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in person again. Sorry I missed you today. Take care.